Hello, here we are on our second video, just discussing basic science stuff. We previously talked about the scientific method, and I thought that this was a pretty good summary of the scientific method. You make an observation, then you ask a question, and then you form a hypothesis, which is your educated guess of the answer to the question. Then you plan out how you're going to test your hypothesis and you record your data and you analyze it. And then finally you make your conclusion and figure out whether or not the data that you've collected supports the hypothesis that you formed originally. And throughout this whole process, you are reflecting and thinking and trying to figure out if you are accurately studying your observation, if you're accurately trying to answer your question, and if the data that you're collecting is actually testing your hypothesis. So now we're going to talk about this spot right here, which is conclude and report. Okay, so once you've gone through the process of collecting your data and analyzing your data, then you need to share that information with other scientists. Okay, so science must be shared in order for society and the knowledge about a certain scientific discipline or topic to be advanced. So we do that with what's called a peer review process. Okay, so the scientist studies something, right? They collect their data, they analyze their data, and then they write up what they did into a report. And then what they do is they find a scientific journal that is appropriate for publishing that report or that science. So they might say, okay, well, this journal publishes these kinds of topics, which are the same as what I just did my science on. So I'm going to submit my report to this journal and see if they will publish my science. Okay, so once the journal gets it, the editor reviews it and decides whether or not it's worthy of being sent on for further review. Okay, the further review is where the peer review process really happens. So the peer reviewers are other scientists who are familiar with the topic of this research report. Okay, so these scientists will read through the report and they will try to decipher whether or not this is good science. If the science has been carried out in the correct way, if the analysis has been done correctly, if the conclusions that they are drawing seem to be logical conclusions, and it's a good report, then they might say, yeah, let's publish this, right? So if an article finally meets editorial and peer standards, it is published in a journal. If they read through it and they see some errors, they could either say, the science is bad, don't publish this at all, or there are some small things that need to be corrected before it can be published. And the editor might go through and say there are some formatting or grammatical errors that need to be corrected before this can be published, even if the peer reviewers say that it's good. Okay, so then they might send it back to the scientists and say, you need to make these corrections and then resubmit your article to us, right? And then, or they might return and say, we're not going to publish this. These are the reasons why, these are the errors, okay? So when we say that a scientific journal article has been peer reviewed, that means that before it is even published, other scientists have read it and have decided that the science was good, okay? So it's sort of like they're saying, we don't want bad science getting published. Okay, because we don't want people who might not be as good at deciphering what bad science is to then read it and think that it's accurate, right? They want the best reports being published, and that's what the peer review process is intended to do. Okay, so here are some examples of peer-reviewed scientific journals. So I just put a collection of them up here: Conservation Biology, Journal of Computational Biology, Asian Research Journal of Agriculture, Conservation Letters, Evolutionary Biology, Marine Biology, Journal of Mathematical Biology, Journal of Research in Biology. So these are basically, I looked up biology scientific journals, right? But there are thousands of scientific journals out there, depending, more than thousands probably, depending on what the topic is you want to look at, right? There are peer-reviewed scientific journals on psychology, on any science, basically. Okay. And again, if it's peer-reviewed, then that means that it has been reviewed prior to being published. So all of the articles in these journals have been reviewed by other scientists prior to them getting published in these journals, okay? And then once they get published, now everyone else can access them and read them. So other scientists that didn't participate in the peer-reviewed process, other scientists can then pick up this journal and look for an article on this topic that they're interested in, and they can read through that, and they can get information from it. They can get ideas about further science that they can do. They can also look for errors in it, and if they find errors or disagree with the conclusions, then they could then write a letter back to that scientific journal, and the editor might decide to publish that letter. And this could be like an ongoing kind of conversation between multiple scientists where they're continuing to write letters and having them published in the journal, and other people can read them and disagree on the science that was done or the conclusion that was drawn. And so this is, a way for scientists to be able to really try to get to the truth, to gain the knowledge, right? And science is gaining knowledge. So that's the point. Now, I want to make a point in saying that magazines are not peer-reviewed. Okay, so although, there are magazines that focus on science, those magazines aren't peer-reviewed in a way where, an article is sent out to scientists and they approve it, right? The decision of whether or not something is published is just the editor of the magazine, right? The journalist who writes the article and the editor of the magazine decides to publish it, okay? So magazines are not peer-reviewed. So I wanted to show you some examples of a peer-reviewed journal article versus a magazine article. Okay, so I searched for a peer-reviewed scientific journal article on whale evolution. Okay, and I found this one. So I'm just going to show you what we can learn from just looking at this. Okay, so right here, land to sea transition in early whales, evolution of Eocene Archaeoceti cetacea in relation to skeletal proportions and locomotion of living semi-aquatic mammals. This is the title of the journal article. This here, Philip D. Gingrich, is the author, and lots of times what you would have is multiple authors listed. So there could be 10 authors. But usually the author that is listed first, it's not listed in alphabetical order. It's actually listed in order of who basically did the most work, for the most part, right? So the first author is going to be the one who did the most part. But that also has a little bit to do with the power of the people that are working on it, where, sometimes the grad students will be at the end of the list, even though the grad students did a lot more work. But because they're grad students, they're not as powerful as the main scientists, and so they get listed last. So that's a little problem in science, but there's lots of problems in the field of science. That's just one of them. But for the most part, whoever the first author is usually the one that knows the most about it. So lots of times underneath this particular, let's see, does it have it down here? Yeah, it does. Usually the author, somewhere, and usually in the first page, it will say the affiliation of the author and a way to contact them. So if you ever read, if you become a scientist and you read all these scientific journal articles and you ever have a question about something, you can find the contact information for the scientist who did the research and posted the report. Okay, so now I'm going to go up here, right here, paleobiology. That is the title of the scientific journal. 29 is the volume number, and 3 is the issue number. It was published in 2003, and you can find it on pages 429 to 454 in this volume and issue of Paleobiology. Okay, so let's take a look at the actual article itself. Okay, so we see the title, we see the author, and then this first thing that we usually see is an abstract, or sometimes it will be called a summary, because that's what it is. It is a summary of this scientific journal article, of this report. So it's going to have a little bit of background information. It's going to have basically what the scientists were trying to accomplish, like what the question they're trying to answer was, maybe a little bit on the methods that they used, their results, and a brief conclusion. So it's going to be a very condensed form of the report. And for where you are in your science education right now, reading that is probably enough. Getting through a full scientific journal article takes a lot of time and a lot of practice. So let's look through this so that we can see that there are a couple of different sections. So here we have the first section after the abstract is the introduction. The introduction is going to give background on the topic. This is where the scientist has done research into looking at other scientific journal articles and maybe looking at books as well to get a good understanding of the topic that they're studying. In the introduction, you're also going to find some information about the question that they're trying to answer and their hypothesis as well. Okay, so if I keep on scrolling down, usually the next section is titled Materials and Methods, or it can be methods or some form of that. It depends on the scientific journal what the name of it is. So the Materials and Methods section is going to be a very thorough description of what the scientists did to test their hypothesis. And it will include the materials that were necessary for testing this as well. And basically, it has to be detailed enough that if another scientist decided that they wanted to study the same thing, that they could basically repeat the study. And lots of times, scientists who want to study something that's similar, but maybe like a different species or in a different environment or something like that, they can go through and they can look at how somebody else did it. And they could say, okay, I can kind of follow along with this, and I'm going to try to do something similar to this and see if I get similar results. Okay, so the materials and methods section, again, are basically like a list of instructions. They're very specific, but it's not written as, instructions. It's just a very thorough explanation of what they did. Okay, the next section would usually be called results. And so let me scroll down here. In this article, it doesn't specifically say results. Instead, it has the results broken into headings that are based on the methods that they described. So principal components analysis of living semi-aquatic mammals is the results for one part of their study. Okay. Then I keep on scrolling down and you'll notice that usually there are a lot of figures. They're usually graphs in the results section. So these are graphs. They are, kind of beyond what we're studying now in the way that we look at graphs. But they are graphs. They are a visual depiction of the data. Okay, so I'm going to keep on scrolling down here. Here's another section about the results of another part of their research. More images and a table. Okay, there's another section on results. And I keep on scrolling down. And finally, we get to the last section, which is titled Discussion. It can also be titled Conclusion. So basically, this section is going to be what conclusions are the scientists drawing from the results that they got. They might also say, we ran into this problem, so, we had to do analysis a little bit different, or, you know, they might say some different things, like some problems that they went through and some things that they might continue to study in the future. And, you know, what conclusions they can draw from the research that they did themselves, and what they can do next. Okay. And then the very end here, so there's often acknowledgments, but at the very end is the literature cited section. So each one of these journal articles, so here's one right here, okay, here's the next one, and they're all in alphabetical order based on the first author's last name. Although for some journals, they might do it slightly differently, but for the most part, that's usually how they do it. What this literature cited means is that the author of this report looked through and used information from every one of these articles or newspaper headings or books, or, you know, even personal communications are listed here. In literature cited as well. So every single thing, and you can see how long this is. So to give you an idea of, you know, scientists do a lot of reading and looking into what other scientists have done. And that is what is included in this literature cited section. Okay. Now for comparison, I also wanted to show you what a magazine article looks like. So again, I looked up whale evolution, and I looked up a magazine, the Smithsonian, so great magazine. And this article is How Did Whales Evolve? So if I look through here, you know, it's all kinds of information about how whales evolved, history, that kind of thing. And I get to the bottom, I get to the end of the article, and notice there is no literature cited section, right? So, you know, sometimes a magazine article might have some, you know, literature cited stuff, but it's definitely not going to be to the extent that we just saw it in that previous scientific journal. And also, this is not scrolling very quickly. Also, you'll notice that there are not headings: introduction, materials and methods, results, conclusion, discussion. Okay, so if you're reading something like this and you are like, I'm not sure if this is a scientific journal article or not. First, you can look at, is there an introduction, materials and methods, results section? Does it have graphs in it? And then you can also look down and see, is there a literature cited section? And also, you can look at the name of the source. So in this case, Smithsonian Magazine gives it, you know, gives a pretty clear indication that it is not a scientific journal. Okay, so again, you know, you might see something that's called Scientific American or Popular Science or Discover, and those all might sound like, you know, they're about science, and they are about science, but they are not peer-reviewed scientific journal articles. Okay, so there is, you know, a big difference there. Another important thing that we need to know about science is that a lot of science is depicted in a visual depiction of the data. So what we call that is a graph. All right, so a graph is the visual depiction of data, right? If you have a bunch of numbers on a spreadsheet, you're not really going to be able to tell if there's any kind of pattern or there are relationships between these numbers, right? So the way that we can look at that relationship is by graphing it. You know, scientists will also do statistical analyses on our data as well to see the likelihood of, you know, different results. But for our class, we're pretty much just going to do a visual depiction of the data to look at our results, okay? So when you're creating a graph, the first thing that you need to do is determine what type of graph you're going to make, depending on what kind of data you've collected, okay? So They're generally like three types of graphs. You've got a line graph or a scatter plot, and that helps to show trends. And if you have anything over time, usually you're going to use a line graph or a scatter plot. Then you have a bar or a column graph, and that's going to help to show differences and make comparisons between different variables. And then finally, you have a pie chart, which also is used to make comparisons, but it's over a 100% comparison. So you basically have a pie, and you take slices of that pie and see how much of the total pie each part makes up. Okay, so here is an example of a line graph. Okay, so we are looking at human growth on this line graph. So on the x-axis, which is the horizontal axis, we have age in years, so that's time passing by. And then on the y-axis, which is the vertical axis, we have length. So how does the length of a human change over time, right? That's growth. So if you're looking at this, you can see that, over time, a human gets longer up to a certain point, and then they stop growing. And this data is only showing us up to about 22 years old. So we can't say anything about human growth or human length after 22 years old. But, most likely if we were to continue this on, up to maybe even 100 years old, this line might go down just because, gravity compresses, all of our open spaces, and it makes us a little bit shorter over time. We can also see that the rate of growth changes, right? The first 2 years or so, you see the greatest rate of growth, the greatest increase in the length of a human, and then it kind of stabilizes, but we're still growing, and then at about 16 or 17, humans don't usually grow very much. Okay, so that's what we can learn from looking at this graph. And again, this is called a line graph. It is a line. Basically, dots are connected, data points are connected by a line. If this was a scatter plot, we would just see the dots and we wouldn't see a line. And usually there would be a lot more dots than this. And then we could put a best fit line through those many dots. Okay. Another example of a graph is a bar column graph. And again, this is used to show comparisons. And for example, this is showing you a comparison in the heights of different trees. So in blue is the sequoia, in red is cedar, in green is ponderosa pine, and in purple is live oak. So from looking at this graph, we can see what the tallest tree out of these four is, and that's going to be the sequoia. We can see what the shortest tree out of these four types of trees is going to be, and that's going to be the live oak. And then we can see that cedar and ponderosa pine are very similar in height. Okay, and then the third type of graph or visual depiction of data is a pie chart. So again, you got a whole pie that equals 100%, and then you can take little slices out to show you what portion of that 100% is each different category. So for example, we're looking at the ocean on Earth, and we can look at how much of the total ocean is made up by each ocean. So in blue, we have the Pacific, in red, we have the Atlantic, in green, we have the Indian, and in purple, we have the Arctic. So from looking at this pie chart, even if these percentages weren't shown here, you can get an idea of about how much of the overall ocean is taken up by each one. So we can see that the Pacific Ocean makes up about half of the world's ocean. So if you were to take all of the continents on planet Earth and put them together, they would fit in the Pacific Ocean. That's how big the Pacific Ocean is, okay? Then we get to the Atlantic Ocean. The Atlantic Ocean takes up about 25% of the world's ocean. The Indian Ocean takes up 20%, so it's very close to size in the Atlantic, but a little bit smaller. And then you have the Arctic Ocean, which is the smallest of these four oceans, taking up only about 3.5% or so. Okay, so again, we can see a comparison in the size of these individual oceans. Okay, the second thing that you want to do is determine which variable to put on each axis. Okay, so we've got two axes. We've got the x-axis, which is the horizontal axis, and we've got the y-axis, which is the vertical axis. So on the horizontal axis, if you are looking at something over time, time is always going to go on your horizontal axis. Okay, but sometimes you just have two different variables, and you have to decide which one is going to go on the x and which one is going to go on the y. Generally speaking, the x-axis is going to have the independent variable, the variable that's basically controlled and not the thing that you're measuring per se, right? The y-axis is the thing that you're measuring. So sometimes what you can say to yourself is, does this depend on that, or does that depend on this? Okay, so, you know, for example, let's say that we wanted to look at the relationship between arm length and height. So we took a bunch of people and we measured how tall they were and we measured how long their arms are. And so we had that data. We had length of arms and we had height. So how would we graph that? You know, basically we'd say, okay, this person had this height and this arm length. Let's find this on and put it on a graph. But which one do we put where? So you have to ask yourself, is arm length dependent on height, or is height dependent on arm length? And I think that what you should say is arm length is dependent on height, right? What you would see if you graph that is that the taller you are, the longer your arms are. Okay, so that's just, you know, one way of thinking about it. All right, and finally, if you're doing it by hand, you have to determine the variable range on the scale. So, right, if say you have a piece of graph paper, you've got all these little squares, you have to determine what your starting point is and what your ending point is. Okay, you don't want to make a graph that has a cluster of little dots in one little corner. If you do that, you can't really see any kind of relationship. All you see is a little tiny cluster of dots, right? Let's see if I can draw this here. Okay, so let's say I have a graph over here, and, you know, I'm going to say, like, sometimes people have learned that, you know, you start at 0 and, you know, you end at 100 or something, or you end at 10 or something like that, right? So my x-axis goes from 0 to 100 and my y-axis goes to 0 to 100. Okay, and then I put my data in and my data is like, you're like, okay, well, I can't really see anything on that because my, you know, I only see like this little tiny cluster of dots, right? So that's not what you want to do. You don't need to start your graph at 0. What you want to start your graph at is the number that is going to make it utilize the most space. Okay, so what that looks like to me is maybe we should start at 50. Okay, and then go up to maybe 80. Okay, and if I actually had data in front of me, I could say what my last point was and what my first point was, right? And then over here, it looks like it starts at about 80 on my y-axis and maybe goes up to 100. Okay, and then if I put my data, you know, use that range, then maybe I might get something that looks like this. And then you can see a clear relationship, and we could even add a best fit line through there, which would look something like that. And you can actually see a relationship between your variable on your x-axis and your variable on your y-axis, whatever those might be. So say maybe that's height and that's arm length, right? The taller you are, the longer your arms are, okay? Okay. Then the last thing that I need to talk about as far as a general science lecture is on the units of measure that we use in science. Okay, in science we use the metric system. So let's see for each type of measurement what unit of measure we should be using. So in the metric system, length is measured in meters or centimeters or kilometers, where in the United States we're used to measuring in inches or feet. So to give you an idea of the difference, 1 meter is equal to 39.37 inches or 3.281 feet. So, estimate that 1 meter is 3.3 feet. So if you took a meter stick, then a meter stick, which lots of teachers use to like point to things during their lectures, right? The meter stick is 3.3 feet. If you took a ruler and you looked at a ruler, which is 12 inches, you would see that that ruler is about 30.5 centimeters. Okay, so just to get an idea of length using the metric system. Mass is measured in grams, so 1 pound equals 453.59 grams, right? So grams is a pretty small unit of measure compared to pounds. So, say if I was going to measure myself in the metric system, I would probably use kilograms, right? Because kilograms, there are 1,000 grams in a kilogram. All right. So if I were to measure myself in grams, I would end up with like a really big, long number. So that's why I would use kilograms, because I don't want this big, huge, long number. Okay. Time is measured in seconds, so that's pretty easy. And then temperature is measured in Celsius. So 0 degrees Celsius equals 32 degrees Fahrenheit, and 100 degrees Celsius equals 212 degrees Fahrenheit, right? We in the United States are used to seeing our temperatures in degrees Fahrenheit, so that's why I'm showing you this. So what is 0 degrees Celsius and 32 degrees Fahrenheit equal to? Hopefully you said the freezing point of water. That is the temperature at which water freezes. And 100 degrees Celsius and 212 degrees Fahrenheit, what do you think that is? Hopefully you're saying it's the boiling point of water. That's the temperature at which water boils, okay? And just for your own understanding, I'm not ever going to ask you to convert from Celsius to Fahrenheit or from Fahrenheit to Celsius, but just to give you an idea, if you had your temperature in degrees Celsius and you wanted to go to degrees Fahrenheit, you would multiply your degrees Celsius by 9, divide by 5, and add 32. If you had your temperature in degrees Fahrenheit and you wanted to go to degrees Celsius, you would subtract your degrees Fahrenheit by 32, multiply by 5, and divide by 9, and that would give you the equivalent in degrees Celsius. Okay, and just to give you kind of an idea of different temperatures, here's a chart. So 0 degrees Celsius is 32 degrees Fahrenheit. So again, freezing point of water. If we go up 10 degrees Celsius, that's 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's, thinking of the temperature outside, that would be like kind of a chilly day, right? 20 degrees Celsius is 68 degrees Fahrenheit. So that would be a pretty mild, comfortable temperature. 30 degrees Celsius is 86 degrees Fahrenheit, so that would be a pretty warm day. And 40 degrees Celsius is 104 degrees Fahrenheit, so that would be a pretty hot day if it was 40 degrees Celsius out, okay? Okay, so that is it for our general science discussion. And if you have questions, there are a couple of different ways that you can go about asking those questions. One, you can post a question under the weekly discussion. If you post it on the weekly discussion, I don't usually respond to them very quickly, because usually I grade all of the weekly discussion like the week after they're already due. And so if you have a question that you want answered more quickly, then that's probably not the best route. Another way that you could save your questions and ask them during our weekly Zoom meetings. So that would be, the week, if you already started early on in the week, that you can ask at the weekly Zoom meeting at the beginning of the week, or depending on when our meeting is, you could ask at that time. You could also log on during my student assistance hour and ask me then, or you can always email me as well, okay? So email is probably, the fastest if it's not on the weekend, right? I probably will get back to you a lot more quickly by email than you having to wait for a scheduled assistance hour or a scheduled Zoom meeting. But, email is just if you really have something that you need an answer to within the next 24 to 48 hours. Okay, so that's a couple of different ways that you can ask questions, and of course, don't hesitate to ask any questions that you might have, anything you might be confused about with the lectures or with the class or anything like that. Okay, all right, and I hope you have a good day or night.